Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our good friend, Marilyn McEntyre. Marilyn is a highly accomplished writer and teacher. Those are my words, not hers. In addition to American literature, she's taught medical humanities, literature in the natural world, portraiture and character in literature and art, approaches to autobiography, and a variety of other writing courses. She was also a speaker at the Writing for Life and Frederick Buechner Writers Conferences that I produced a few years ago. Having left full-time teaching, she also speaks for university, church, and community groups, leads retreats, and offers short courses and writing workshops and personal editing services. In addition to the 22 books she's written, her writing has appeared in a wide variety of academic and trade publications. Her new book is titled Start with a Word, on the craft and adventure of writing from Erdman's. Now, what I'm showing you here is a very early uncorrected proof. It's not even as far along as an advanced reader copy, but thank you, Erdman's, for sending it to me so I could read it early and get ready for this interview with Marilyn. So, Marilyn, thanks so much. It's so great to see you again.
It's such a pleasure to see you.
Congratulations on yet another new book.
Thank you.
And I should mention also Marilyn's website, MarilynMcEntyre.com. And McEntyre is McEntyre. So MarilynMcEntyre.com. So what else would you like folks to know about you besides what I kind of briefly summarized there?
Well, it's a pretty good summary. I've done some combination of teaching and writing all of my adult life, and the intersection of those two things continues in new ways. One of the programs I'm working with is actually designed for older adults to think about what this season of life is about, and many of them often in the form of memoir, but many of them decide, I've always wanted to write something. I want to write my stories, or I want to write some poems, or I want to write reflections. And so I think that it's been particularly satisfying in these last 10 to 15 years to help older adults write the book they always wanted to write, or just play with words in some new ways and give themselves permission to do that. It's a different kind of teaching, coaching, being with, and it's a joy.
Mm-hmm. So I know you do kind of a variety of work, different things. Can you talk a little bit about, some of those specifics?
Yeah, mm, every month, every first Saturday, I give an online workshop through New College Berkeley, which is a group to know about. It's newcollegeberkeley.com, org. Um, they are attempting to be what the director calls a third space, not the academy, not the church, but a center for um, Christian reflection, broadly ecumenical, thoughtful conversations together. And those conversations, the director is just wonderful about staging conversations about everything from AI to um, the state of civil rights now to the role of the arts in worship, and a whole spectrum
Mm.
of very current topics. So it's been a pleasure to work with them. So these once a month workshops are an hour and a half, and each time it's a different topic. Like this past first Saturday, it was what your narrator knows, and having people play around with their understanding of their own narrators, even if it's a very personal form like memoir. The you that speaks on the page is different from the you that is embodied. So who is that, and what does she know, and what is she not disclosing, and sort of so playing with the craft like that. Another time it's been focused on the power of metaphor, or ways of camera work, what I call camera work. So it's really fun to take this topical approach to
Mm.
writing, and I try to keep it playful because I think writing is best when you're in a kind of play space,
Mm.
receptive, open, noticing what happens, not over planning. I really just think that's important, not to try to nail everything down before you start. I think that
Interesting.
deadens the process.
Interesting. So as a planner, that's a little bit contrary to my nature. Anyway, So I really want to talk about some of your earlier books because there's so many that I just really loved.
Mhm.
One of them is titled Word by Word, A Daily Spiritual Practice. Um, and there was one particular aspect of that that I just love, which is the organizational structure that you used. Each chapter's title was a single word. And then on the first page of each chapter was a series of phrases that follow that word. And then
Mhm.
within the chapter, you write more about each one of those phrases. So for instance, the first chapter is titled Listen, and the first phrase is for the guidance you need. So I'm not sure exactly what about that structure thrilled me, but I still really love it. How did you come up with that approach?
Well, I don't know if it was I think it might have been after word by word, but I did, upon request, write a little book about lists, which you
Yeah, well,
probably.
that's another book I want to talk about. Make a list because I love that one too.
So I don't actually find outlines, the kind of outline you learn to do in school, very useful. And as you say, you are a planner, you think differently. I try not to be too prescriptive about how to write. This book that just came out, it's not a how to write. There's a lot of try this, try this, try this, see what happens, see what works, see what opens up. Um, but the book about lists, it helped me to see that as soon as you start to make a list, like 5 things people need to know now about the Constitution, or 12 things I've learned about the church, or 7 things or 3 things. As soon as you start to make a list, something starts to happen where more comes and then more comes. And if you don't stick a number on it, if you just say, I'm just going to stay with this for 3 minutes and see what comes, you begin to surprise yourself. And so it's a really lively process. And so if I sat with in that word by word book, if I sat with a word and like listen and thought, what is what does listening entail? What does it mean to listen well? What are you listening for? And that question generates a little list of responses, and then those were what I worked with. But I love that. It's a very generative process, and it's so simple.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the whole list, model for me is the way I think. So
Hmm.
like all the documents that I've produced for myself in any business that I've been involved in, have been bullet lists.
Yeah,
And it is so good at what you're saying in terms of, once you have something down, it's captured. And then you go on to the next thought.
yeah.
Then it's captured and you're going to, so it has that aspect of it, which is very helpful for me.
Hmm.
Um, but it also allows me to peel the onion, right? So
Exactly.
you do the one layer of the list, just like at the first page of the chapter that I mentioned, and you get that down. Then you go to the next level of detail below it. You know what I mean? So it just allows, it supports the same kind of thought process that is
Yeah.
natural for me. Linear, organized, or whatever. And so, as much as there's all these other forms of communication, whether it's like a PowerPoint presentation or video or graphics or whatever, none of those work for me just as much as the simple bullet list.
Right. And when you say linear, yes, of course it is because it's a list, but I think of it more like, those Russian dolls where
Hmm.
there's more inside of that, and then there's more inside of
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
So if you
Well,
go
the other way
back,
to think of it is like with software programming, recursive lists, where they go back and kind of work on it themselves.
yeah,
That's another analogy, I would say.
yeah, yeah. But I
Well,
think one of the things about um, claiming your own capacity and, in a sense, your right to play with words and be the author of whatever it is you want to give shape to and offer people is that you find out how you think.
hmm,
And if and not everybody processes things the same way. So I
uh,
think part of the art of teaching or coaching is it's like midwifery. This is your baby. Let me see if I can help you get it out. I think of the midwife analogy all the time now since I do so much writing coaching with people,
hmm,
just to try to say, what is it you're hoping for that will happen? And,
hmm,
help get articulate that, but not the midwife is. it's thrilling and it's humbling, and this is not about me.
Mm,
And I told you I recently visited a good friend who got a cancer diagnosis, and on my way to see her, I thought, this is what I learned in hospice. The point is, this is not about how you would do it or the choices you would make.
mm,
It's about being attentive to what this person needs and wants right now. And
mm,
so I think helping people find out what works for them is part of the pleasure.
mm. That's a real nuanced skill, though, right? I mean,
Well,
to
you
me,
develop it over time.
so let's get into the new book. As I said, that's, start with the word. How did that book come about? What drew you to do this one?
Well, my wonderful editor, Lisa at Erdman's, suggested it. And my first response was, you know what? I don't think the world needs another book about writing. And she very generously said, I think yours would be different. I think you should write it. So
Uh,
I
good point.
accepted the invitation, and bless her heart. I love Lisa. She's, and I wave that flag. She's a wonderful editor. And editors are largely unsung heroes of the writing world. Um, but I did. I have taught writing for a long time, and
Yeah.
I went back to all my handouts. I told my husband one time, I really think that my genre is the handout. I think that's where I've put so much of my writing over the years. But it was fun to go back through uh, layers of my teaching life and see how I have attempted to encourage people to play with sentences and develop paragraphs, and what difference it makes if you know a little bit of grammar and you can say, if you shifted this prepositional phrase to the end of the sentence, you get a different distribution of weight. And
Hmm,
finding ways to talk about writing metaphorically that kind of wake people up
hmm,
is a lot of the fun. So that's how it started to come together, was just looking back over what I've written about writing. And the title, Start with a Word, came very easily because that's what I've said to so many students who say, I know I have this paper to write, I just can't get an idea. And I think, don't start with an idea, start with a word. What if you start a sentence with although? I mean, they have to have some sense of the topic, right? But it's so interesting what happens when you just give somebody a prompt that's so tiny. It's like that little shove you give a kid who's learning to ride a bike. That's
hmm,
all they need.
hmm,
So when I say start a sentence with although, everybody can do that. But as soon as you do that, you've already said something that opens the door to the next thought. And you find that you're on a trail of some kind, that you may backtrack, you may go off to one side, but something happens if you start with a word or a phrase. I wrote that book called What's in a Phrase, but just
hmm,
start with a phrase. Like, one exercise in here is take some famous phrases and see what happens if you just put them on the page. Like, flights of angels. I've thought so often when I've been at memorial services of Hamlet's or Horatio's words to Hamlet as Hamlet is dying. And he's his beloved friend, and he says, "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest."
hmm,
And I find that such a moving line, but the term flights of angels is just so resonant, and it's a it's a kind of luminous image. So if I just set that phrase on a page, I would have things to say about it, which I
hmm,
just did, right? Takes me right to Hamlet. But but those things are little thought starters that don't get you stuck in the parameters of a box you need to stay in.
hmm,
It's not
hmm.
something to fill in, it's something to allow to grow and see where it wants to take you. And
Wow.
that's another thing, is to tell people, take the I out of the sentence that you say to yourself when you're writing. And instead of saying, what do I need to do here? Try saying, what wants to happen here? Just so that you're looking at the what's emerging in a kind of organic way, and that something is afoot. I really do think that for people of faith, writing is very much related to your prayer life. If you
Hmm,
if you open in a sense of receptivity, like this is what's been given to me to do, thank you, help me, show me, let me notice, help me notice what's happening. And then I say thank you a lot. Like if I feel like I really nailed that sentence, it makes me happy. And I just sort of feel like it's spirit work, you know.
Mm,
It's not
mm.
to romanticize it over much or sentimentalize it, but I certainly think that for people of faith, the connection between the writing life and the prayer life is pretty close.
Well, certainly the way you approach it, that is, which is really admirable, number one. And I think it's a really great role model for other people to
Mm,
emulate and learn from.
thank you.
So at the beginning of the book, you talk about reading. And one thing you say is writing seemed a natural, sometimes necessary response to anything worth reading. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that what happens when you open a book is that you're invited into a conversation. I mean, effectively, the writer, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is saying, come with me. If you'll take this on my terms, I'll show you something you wouldn't have seen before. And so thinking of it as a conversation is to read actively and to give yourself to read slowly for one thing, which is
Mm,
very countercultural now, but to give yourself permission to pause after a few paragraphs and say, huh. In fact, one exercise I've given students frequently is exactly that. As you read the assigned chapters tonight, um, just try to note it. You know, you don't have to read the whole thing. I often said reading carefully and attentively is much more important than turning every page. So if you don't finish, I'm not going to test you on whether you finish the chapter. I'm going to see what you have to say about what you read.
mm,
So if you pause after a couple of paragraphs and notice what just made you register like, huh, or ew, or yeah, or something, wow, where did you have a little felt response? Or I don't know about that. And just put a check in the margin. Don't even try to write down
mm.
marginalia. Just put a check there and then come back and see what happened there. What was it that gave you pause? Because that's a point of entry into the conversation. So I think that whether or not you write responses to what you read, becoming a responsive reader is, or becoming a good reader, and that can mean a lot of things, is to kind of read like a writer, which is not just to notice what the writer said, but how he or she said it. Like,
Mm.
how did Melville do what he did is more important than what happened in Moby Dick, I think. And
Yeah,
how
yeah,
it's
yeah.
just such a more interesting question.
So here's one example of you doing that.
Hmm.
So I'm going to read something that you wrote after you gave a quote by Will Gaffney. And you said, what a wonderful way to think about reading as a discernment process, a process of seeking and expecting revelation, which is exactly how personally I approach reading. It's like, what am I going to learn from this? That's the only reason why I want to read anything is because what am I going to learn from it?
Mhm.
But you also ask, what do I have to let go of to get the gift that's being offered? That's probably tougher for me to do. So can you elaborate on that part?
Well, I can. And actually, I think that that question came up poignantly for me early in my college teaching career. This was years ago. I was teaching The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. And Hemingway uh, is a wonderful writer. And he lived in a generation that was sort of a generation of white male writers, not entirely, there were plenty of good women writers, but there was a lot of unexamined anti-Semitism in
Mm,
his generation,
mm,
as there was a lot of unexamined racism. And does that make this person not worth reading? Well, there's a good question. So the second day I met with the students. One very bright, very wonderful student who sat in the front row said, this book's really hard for me. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, I'm Jewish. My Jewish identity means a lot to me, and the character of Robert Cohn is really drawn in such problematic, stereotypical ways. It's offensive, and I don't know. I don't know how to position myself to read it. I mean, I'm sort of putting those words in her mouth, but that was her
Mm-hmm.
point. And so my response to that was, well, okay, you don't have to read it. There are other good books. And I've told all of you, if you really, for one reason or another, find yourself so resistant to a book that it's going to be an obstacle to your learning, then come talk to me and I'll find another book you can read. But then I said, every generation of writers has something, you know, or male writers have maybe unexamined misogyny, and this is a women's college, and what are we going to do with that? Are you just going to decide you're not going to learn from these guys? Or are you going to decide, what am I willing to forgive in order to receive what's being offered? Which is basically what you have to do in a friendship. If you're going to have a long-term friendship or marriage, any relationship, there has to be some kind of willingness to say, I'm going to bracket that. I don't like it, but it's not big enough for me to give up the relationship.
Mhm.
And so I think, what do you have to let go of? With Joyce, for instance, you have to let go of a certain impatience for plot. If you're a plot junkie, then Joyce is not going to be your idea of a good time because you don't get a whole lot of plot. You get other things. Or if you're going to read Annie Dillard, who's one of my favorite writers, you have to be willing to go down some rabbit trails and follow her leaps of logic. And so what do I have to be willing to do here? And what I have to let go of, my impatience, my presumptions about how this topic ought to be addressed, um, my assumptions about, male writers or white writers or old writers or whatever. But I think to articulate what it is that makes room for me to be more receptive and to notice more attentively what's happening in a kind of detached way, that's an important part of educating ourselves as readers.
Well, I mean, that's really, an important point. Like you said, that it is so applicable well beyond just reading, right? But, in your instance, you're naming it, right? You're acknowledging it and you're
Yeah.
kind of putting it in its place, so to speak,
Mhm.
and moving on with that as, background or knowledge or it's there,
Yeah.
but don't let it get in the way of what else I want to accomplish out of this.
Yeah.
Is what it sounds like to me.
Yeah. And I actually ended up saying that so often to students that, at the end of the year when they do these spoofs on their professors, I remember one of them impersonated me and she kind of wandered onto the stage and looked around at people and she said, so what I want to know is, what do you have to do what do you have to forgive to get the gift? Or what do you have to let go of to get the gift? Yeah. And
That's good.
was
Well,
scat
they
laughing.
learned, didn't they?
I
They learned
guess.
from you. They didn't forget. So, go back to the book here. You go into a lot of it detail regarding, ways to improve a person's writing. Um, what I'd love for you to talk about is how do we improve our thinking, before or during our writing?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I don't know whether it was Auden or Forster, it might have been Forster who said famously, how do I know what I think till I see what I say?
Hmm.
And of course, that isn't true for everybody, but I think for people who are word oriented and people who have the summoning from the spirit or genetics or whatever to love words and work with them, that finding out how you think is part of your writing life. How do I get to a place where I am deeply satisfied with what's happening here? Is that what you mean? That writing and thinking. But I think a fallacy that is reinforced in a lot of classroom life is you think and then you write. And so what I've tried to shift is the focus there to say, as you write, you begin to think and then notice, just notice what's happening. Notice what you notice. And then I also played with notice that you noticed what you noticed, which gets into some psychological stuff.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
just notice what's happening on the page. That requires actually grammar. And it's interesting, again, that grammar is often kind of set aside like, well, this is something you have to know, like how the car works or something. But I think, no, you need it as a language so that you can look at a sentence and say, oh, look at this. Um, there's a long subordinate clause which contains two prepositional phrases, and maybe we need to reconstruct this into two sentences. Or, oh, this is a compound sentence. I remember telling one of the writers I worked with, one of your habits is that you tend, for whatever reason, to use a lot of compound sentences. And maybe just go back and make them into two sentences and see what happens. But just noticing that you have certain habits tells you something about how you think.
Mm,
And
wow.
that in itself is really interesting. Do you tend to over modify? Do you tend to try to couple things? Or I think of my dad or Faulkner, when my dad was speaking, he was a very verbal and voluble person. And he'd even orally construct sentences that didn't quite let go of the floor and while he was having his next thought. And
Oh, that's funny.
yeah, but you can learn a lot from just looking at how, just holding on to the how question. How does this writer do what he does or she?
Mm, wow. So what else would you like people to take away from the book?
Well, that requires looking at the table of contents so I can remember what's in it. Oh, play along is one of them. And I think in a couple of my books I've had a chapter on play because many years ago a student put me onto Stephen Nachmanovich's book, Free Play, The Power of Improvisation in Life and Art. And he reaches into multiple spiritual traditions to look at how some deep idea of playfulness, which means openness to what happens, being in the moment, capacity for spontaneity, is in fact a, a measure of spiritual aliveness. And so if you think about people who are playful, they are responsive to what's happening right there.
Mm.
And conversation is improvisation. And so I think to be playful in your writing is to kind of play around with what you're doing. Oh, new paragraph. What should we do now? And yeah, I just said that. I didn't plan to say this, but I think I'm going to say something about what I just said. So that kind of renegotiation of what you're
Mm,
doing,
mm.
staying playful, I think it's really not only delightful, it makes for better writing.
Well, the other thing that strikes me about what you just described is it implies agility and nimbleness,
Yeah.
as opposed to rigidity in
Yes.
your thought process, right? Which I think that alone is an incredibly important skill.
Yeah. And I think that once you decide I can start without altogether knowing where it's going. I mean, think about all the spiritual teachings about walk in trust or, stay open to the spirit. But I can sound really touchy-feely about all this stuff, but I really believe it that even if you are a planner and even if you like outlines, at least to hold them with an open hand and to say, this is kind of what I hope and expect, but I'm going to try to stay watchful about what wants to happen. I've asked a lot of rooms full of students, how many of you have had the experience of after you write an outline, having a new idea that's kind of interesting, but you don't have any place to put it, so you just lay it aside. And almost all of them do.
Mm.
And then I just say that's kind of tragic. Because if a new idea comes, you don't want to just, kill your babies when they want to happen here. So make space for something new to happen and then be attentive to your own interests, your own curiosity, where that's leading you.
Well, this strikes me as one of those examples where you need both, right? You need instances
Yeah.
of structure, and you need instances of agility and nuance and willingness to change. And part of the incredible skill is balancing those, but in the right places.
It is a skill, and it's not that there's nothing to learn, but I do think that almost all learning involves some recognition, self-recognition. Oh, this is how I learn. That just happened. And when it happened, here's what I experienced. And then learning from that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, this has been very helpful because it helps me think better, which
Good.
which I need. So,
Think pretty well.
so I realize you're in the midst of a book launch, but I have to ask you if you've got any other future projects or books or what have you that you're able to talk about.
Yeah, I do, of course. And I don't know how able I am to talk about them, but I have a couple of books on the back burner. But one of the things I've always wanted to write before I die, and I don't know if it'll happen, is something in response to T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, which are difficult poems. They're his last poems. They're mystical, they're and mystifying in a good way. But I sort of feel as though in my life where spirituality and the study of literature come together is in work like that.
Hmm.
And there are lines, talking about what's in a phrase. There are phrases from those poems that have been so life-giving for me.
Wow.
I want to share them. So
Wow. That
it's
sounds pretty
it'll be fun.
like a crowning achievement kind of a,
Well, it would be deeply satisfying.
huh.
I told my husband a while back that I wanted to memorize four quartets, which is very long. It's like a small book. And so he gamely said, "I'll help you." And he would coach me through parts of it. And then I just gave that up. I thought, I'll just write about it. But it's one of those things where lots and lots of the lines and phrases come back. Like with scripture, I know people who have memorized lots of scripture and they can say, oh, this is Matthew 23:13. And I think I can't do that chapter and verse thing, but I have a lot of words and sentences from scripture in me.
Hmm.
And and I think that learning by heart and what you carry in your heart, you want to say thank you for in some way.
Hmm.
So I guess it would be a work of gratitude, that's for sure.
Hmm. Well, I hope that this conversation has been helpful to our audience in thinking new ways and writing new ways. Please check out Marilyn's book, Start with a Word. You can check it out at Erdman's or at marilynmcintyre.com. So, Marilyn, thank you so much again for joining us and for all of your work that's so life-giving to many of us. So, really appreciate that.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to talk to you.